Pro-life talk. Real world answers. This is Life Report.
Welcome to Life Report. I am your host, Josh Brahm. I'm here with Liz Goddard, and joining us via Skype today from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, Mr. Bobby Schindler, Executive Director of the Terri Schiavo Life and Hope Network. Bobby, thanks for joining us tonight.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.
So, Bobby, if you can just start us off, for those that weren't closely following the story of your sister 6 years ago, can you just give a kind of a brief overview of her story?
Well, Terri Schiavo was my sister. 1990, February 25th, 26 years old. Terri collapsed while home alone with her husband, Michael Schiavo. She was physically healthy. We knew there was nothing that we knew about that was ailing Terri, but nevertheless she collapsed. To this day, it's unknown what caused that collapse, but because of that, she went several minutes without oxygen to her brain. And really from that point on became dependent on others for her care. Initially when she was admitted to the hospital that evening, doctors weren't sure if she was going to live or die. Things were very serious. But she did survive, obviously. She was in a coma. She was hooked up to all types of machines during those first initial hours, those first few days. But nevertheless, she survived. She emerged from the coma, and soon after was not hooked up to any types of machines. Everything that was sustaining her a short time after her initial collapse was food and water, the same thing that keeps us all alive.
Right.
Now, because of her her brain injury that occurred from her collapse, she had difficulty swallowing, so she needed a feeding tube in order to receive her food and hydration.
Wow.
But nevertheless, it was the only thing keeping her alive, and it was the only thing keeping her alive in the many years that followed and up until the battle to save my sister. But what a lot of people don't realize is there's a lot of confusion about Terri that still exists. The first couple years, she was improving. She was receiving extensive rehabilitation and therapy. To the point where she was starting to speak. We were all very encouraged by the progress she was making. This was between 1990 and 1992. Unfortunately, her husband, who was the guardian, had a complete say in all medical decisions. My parents had none. And somewhere around 1991, 1992, he shifted his care and loyalty, where Terri was in warehouse and abandoned from really 1992 up until the point when she died in 2005. Our family fought very hard to try and save Terri. Sometime in 1998, Michael petitioned the court. This was 8 years after Terri's initial collapse.
Right.
To take away her feeding tube, her food and water. It did go to trial in January of 2000. Fought very hard during this trial. It was a week-long trial in front of Judge Greer at the Pinellas County, Florida courtroom. He's a lower circuit court judge. The trial lasted for a week. Michael was petitioned the court, as I said, to take away her feeding tube. Our family objected to this. He gave his reasons why he believed Terri should have the feeding tube removed. The judge found in favor of Michael and ordered the Terri feeding tube be removed. And this occurred in 2000, actually a couple weeks after the initial trial in February of 2000. Our family fought very hard for 5 years to try and stop this from happening. March 18th, 2005, Terri's feeding tube was removed. And then subsequently to that, about 14 days later, she died from a slow dehydration and starvation death. That's a real quick summary of Terri's situation.
Now, I've seen some conflicting testimonies online, so clear this up for me. Did Michael wait 30 to 45 minutes after finding Terri before calling 911, or did he find her 30 to 45 minutes after her collapse and then immediately call 911?
Well, we really don't know. As I mentioned, he was the only one home with her at the time of collapse. I was the first one to get there initially, before the paramedics got there. And Michael called my father first. We don't know how long he waited after Terri initially collapsed, but he called my father, and my dad told him to hang up the phone and call 911, which he did. And then my dad called me. We lived in the same apartment complex, so I was able to be there
Right.
in just a few minutes, and
Okay.
that's when I found Terri laying on the floor. But we don't know, conflicting reports by Michael, what happened that night, which adds a lot of suspicion that we really didn't, I guess, consider at the time, but afterwards we started connecting the dots, and there was inconsistent testimony occurring that really paints a disturbing picture of what might have happened that night.
There are a lot of people, and you mentioned this earlier, but I want to get you to talk a little bit more about it. There are a lot of people that thought that Terri was in a coma or a vegetative state, and can you comment on that and even define vegetative state for us?
Right. Well, there still is, and in fact, we hear reports all the time that she was brain dead, and as you said, in a coma in this we call a persistent vegetative state. I think the persistent vegetative state this diagnosis needs to be abolished, really, from the medical vernacular, if you will. It's a state somewhere where a person is not in a coma, but yet is not fully conscious. But what it does in reality, it dehumanizes a person, really in a subhuman way, as a vegetable. So for me, I don't understand why, and why it's so dangerous. Let me go back. Why it's so dangerous is this is a completely subjective diagnosis. But yet it's being used as a criteria, as it was in my sister's case, to put people to death because they have a profound brain injury. I don't understand why we use it for that reason. It's extremely dangerous because of how unscientific it is. And therefore, when people ask me, well, how would you describe my sister? I would say she was a woman who had a brain injury, just like the millions of people that have a brain injury that are living in our nation today.
Right. Is there actually any type of medical diagnosis or definitive objective definition of what a vegetative state is, or is that just a kind of media and common term that people throw out for a condition like that?
No, it's my understanding it's an actual medical diagnosis, but I just don't understand its objective or its purpose. It seems to me that it's been created or endorsed or has an agenda to kill people with these types of cognitive disabilities. But it is a diagnosis. It's a very dangerous diagnosis. It's diagnosed it's misdiagnosed, upwards of 50% of the time.
Okay.
Which means doctors really don't know if a person or not, if a person is in fact in a persistent vegetative state or not. Almost 50% of the time they're wrong. And what's so dangerous about it is that if you're using it as a criteria to kill, and it's wrong half the time, you can see where the danger enters. Plus not only that, but the stigma it gives, or how we label human beings as being a vegetable. It's something that it doesn't make sense to me, and is really abhorrent.
And so in Terri's case, did she fit that medical criteria for a persistent vegetative state, or is that just something that people assume because that term was used so much in the whole media coverage of her life in those last years?
Well, that's what was so frustrating about Terri's case, is the fact that she did not even meet whatever it was that they set as criteria for the PVS, the persistent vegetative state. Terri was very alive. She interacted with her family and others, doctors. There's video of Terri interacting, and given the fact that she was warehoused for almost 10 years without any rehabilitation or therapy, without even a simple range of motion, it was remarkable that she was as reactive and responsive as she was, being neglected for such a long period of time.
Now, Michael ended Terri's rehab only 2 years after her injury. What progress has she shown in the first 2 years of rehab?
Well, if you look in her medical files during that time, the nurses were making notes how Terri was starting to speak. She was forming words.
Oh, wow.
So our family, I mean, if you know anything about brain injuries, Terri had a very serious brain injury, and although it was little steps or just small improvements, we were the rehab specialists and our family was very encouraged by the improvements Terri was making. And a person with those types of brain injuries needs continual rehab and therapy, or else they will begin to deteriorate. And unfortunately, that's what happened to my sister. Once she started to improve, it was right about then that all therapy had stopped, which was really unfortunate and tragic, because we just don't know how far Terri would have come along. Now, we knew, our family, we knew that Terri was never going to be like she was before her collapse,
Sure.
but nevertheless, she could have improved significantly her quality of life.
What happened to the trust fund that was earmarked for Terri's rehab and therapy?
Oh.
Well, if the trust fund was established, as you said, for just that, it gets a little complex, but Michael would have been successful in having Terri's feeding tube was removed on 3 different occasions, and it was stopped. But if he would have been successful the first time he had it removed in 2001, Michael would have been the inheritor of Terri's remaining trust fund, which at that time was close to $800,000.
Wow.
By the time Terri was killed, we don't know how much was left. We know that a large part of Terri's trust fund, which was supposed to be used for her therapy, was paid to Michael's attorneys that were trying to end her life.
How did that happen? How can
so
that
ironic.
happen?
Well, the court allowed Michael to use these funds to seek Terri's death, simply. And again, our family was powerless against this. My parents had no rights. They could do nothing to help my sister. I often tell the story that there could have been, and there were doctors that believed Terri could have been helped with continuing care and rehabilitation, but there could have been a doctor who had a magic pill that could have cured Terri. Unless we had Michael Schiavo's permission, we could not administer that pill to my sister. So he had 100% control as Terri's guardian, and he used it. In fact, he really used it as a weapon against our family to see Terri's to see to it that Terri would die the way she did.
But he wouldn't even. I mean, this was the thing that was weird to me. Like, I mean, even like if Michael was even trying to keep up this idea that he's a loving husband and just trying to do what Terri wished. I mean, she was in she was in a windowless room. Is that right?
Well, there was windows in her room, but
she wasn't being let outside.
And often the windows were shut, where it just remained dark. No light of day could enter her room.
Why do you think that Michael refused to divorce Terri after moving in with Jody?
Because of the money, quite frankly. If Michael would divorce Terri, he would then lose any chance at recovering any money when Terri would die. So there's no doubt that the money was a factor in why Michael was trying to do this to my sister. He had enormous conflicts of interest that the judge seemed just to ignore. As you mentioned, the fact that he was living with another woman, and this enormous amount of money he was going to inherit upon Terri's death.
Let me read just a few sentences from terrysfight.org on the timeline page. It says this, because I've got a follow-up question for you about this, Bobby. It says, in October of 2001, Terri's family had filed a motion for relief from judgment before Judge Greer and provided new evidence that Terri's neurological condition was better than previously speculated and offered numerous affidavits from medical professionals in support of their claim. Judge Greer denied their motion without a hearing and without review of the supporting affidavits. Bobby, can you expand on what the other medical professionals had determined about Terri?
Well, that she wasn't in this so-called persistent vegetative state, that she could have benefited from therapy and rehabilitation. They believed that if given proper therapy, she could have been taught to swallow again, perhaps enough to where she would not need the feeding tube. So there was just and we have them posted on our website, all the doctors, some of them most prominent neurologists in the country, that believed that Terri was not in the PVS and or could have benefited from proper rehabilitation and therapy. And that's what was so sad and tragic on how hell-bent this judge was in seeing that Terri die this way. It just didn't make sense. And to this day, I get asked over and over again why this judge ruled the way he did when there was so much evidence that conflicted with the fact that Terri was in this horrible neurological condition, one of which many doctors believe could have improved if given the chance.
Now, when the judge issued the order, it was to remove the feeding tube, and I remember when this was happening, and there was a guard posted at her door. No one was allowed to come in and even attempt to feed or give her water, was there any way that she could have survived, or she could have been fed even without the feeding tube?
Probably not. At that time, it had been so long since Terri had any type of swallowing therapy that it would have been very difficult for her to swallow any food. Now,
Right.
hydration's another thing. I mean, she was already swallowing her saliva, which was another indication that
Sure.
she was able to swallow. But at that point, it's just too hard to tell.
It seems like medical professionals are now, like, there have been ideas of it before, but now it's becoming more talked about, and maybe there's more evidence that there are some people that are in supposed PVS states, but they're actually very aware of their surroundings. They're conscious. They're thinking. They're just kind of frozen. Have you done any research on that? Is there any thought that might have been the case with Terri, or do you know anything about that?
Well, no, I've read the research. I've seen with the availability of new technology that better determines people's brain injury. There's no doubt in my mind that Terri was not in a PVS, and she was well aware of what was happening to her. There was times where she was more responsive than other times, but nevertheless, she was. There was times when our family visited her and others where she was very responsive, and just to think that she had to experience almost 2 weeks without any food and water is just too much for me to even dwell upon. Something like that, experiencing something like that, and watching a human being go through that, it's what nightmares are made of. It was absolutely barbaric, and the fact, and to know that we are doing this every day to people in our country, the elderly, those like my sister with these types of cognitive disabilities. It just boggles my mind that we would allow, our country would allow this to happen to our most innocent people, our most innocent Americans.
And do you have any idea of what the rate of these types of deaths, of these starvations, of people who aren't brain dead? Do you have any idea how often that happens? Is there any way to know?
Well, it's not only happening to people with cognitive disabilities like Terri, with these profound brain injuries like Terri. This is happening to fully cognitive people that are wide awake. No, there is no way to know. But what has happened, what has changed, the fact that food and water via feeding tubes is now defined as medical treatment, as artificial life support. That empowers healthcare professionals to take it away from people, whether they want to or not. And this is what is leading to, I believe, countless amount of people being killed every day in our country by having their simple, basic care, food and water taken away, and then subsequently these people dying the way Terri did, and that's why our family is doing what we're doing now. That's why we're advocating for people like my sister and others, because we have lost our sense of compassion in our country, and there is no longer any type of public outrage with people being, it's not only, people aren't only objecting to it, they're allowing it to happen, and they're rationalizing and justifying it, led by our liberal media every single day, that this type of treatment is perfectly okay.
So, and this is a great. You were kind of starting to segue here for me. Tell me a little bit about now. 6 years later, what is the Terri Schiavo Life and Hope Network doing now?
Yeah.
Well, just that. We recognized during Terri's battle, our family was very naive going into this fight, and just had no idea really about anything had to do with this issue. But we learned so much along the way, and we learned just how vulnerable those like Terri were and are, and the elderly is included in that. So we wanted to advocate for these types of people and try to be a voice for them. So now we set up an organization where we try to provide legal and or physician help to families that reach out to us to try and protect loved ones. And unfortunately, you could say we've been quite busy since we started our organization.
Wow.
And we also do a lot of education, a lot of awareness on this issue, because it is so widely misunderstood, and there is so much propaganda when it comes to the mainstream media and how those like Terri are treated and the elderly are treated. in regards to this issue.
You're doing the Q&A sessions that we all do, and you're hearing from pro-life people. What do you think is still the number one misconception about Terri?
Well, that she was hooked up to all types of machines, that she was so-called brain dead, that she was unresponsive.
Right.
People are surprised when I tell them that the only thing keeping her alive was food and water.
Right.
I often tell them that if Terri were alive, that she could be with us at the event, wherever that event was being held. We could have put her in a plane and brought her there. All she needed was a wheelchair, and we could have taken my sister anywhere. She was simply a woman with a cognitive disability. Many people don't even realize that many of our troops coming back from the Middle East are in conditions similar to Terri. There are tens of thousands. We don't know the exact number. But I've heard anywhere estimates of over 50,000 people that are living in our country today that are in a similar condition to Terri or even worse. And what do I mean by this? I'm not talking about people that are in an end-of-life situation, so to speak. I'm talking about people that live a normal lifespan. They are not dying, and they're only being sustained by food and water. I know that's kind of a long answer to your question, but there's just so much misinformation, and what's even more frightening is our general public has been indoctrinated, and we've become very desensitized to how we treat people with these types of disabilities. And as I said, something that would have been thought of as being barbaric and inhumane not that long ago is now being looked upon as being ordinary. And what do I mean by that? I mean by starving, dehydrating people just because they have a disability or just because they're, quote unquote, too old.
Bobby, what kind of legislation could be enacted to prevent Terri's situation from happening again?
I don't know, but I think a good first step would be to redefine the way it used to be, basic care, food and water, even via a feeding tube, as basic and ordinary care. I'm Catholic, and fortunately the Catholic Church still recognizes that food and water, even through a feeding tube, is basic care.
Right.
But our laws across the country do not. They recognize it as medical treatment, and that's what's causing a lot of these problems. If we can get a law somehow passed to recognize food and water through feeding tubes as basic and ordinary care, I think it would go a long way to preventing a lot of these deaths from occurring.
We got a question from one of our Facebook fans. How will the new health care law impact people in situations similar to Terri's?
Well, I think you would be naive not to think that it's only going to get worse. I've been reading a lot of experts commenting on the new health care plan and the fact that there's going to be health care rationing more than there is already.
Right.
The fact that we look at people like my sister that don't give anything back, that are only a so-called drain on our healthcare system, we're going to look for easier ways to kill them. But let's not be fooled here. We're not going to need a healthcare system, an Obamacare, to make the situation. Let me say it this way: it's already happening now. We are killing those like Terri and the elderly, and as I keep repeating, so many others every day by having their food and water taken away. I mean, this is a urgent situation now, and people need to recognize what's going on now. With Obamacare, potentially this could get much worse. So yeah, it's frightening to see what government-controlled healthcare will bring. But I'm trying to tell people that we need to do more to protect those that are in these conditions today, because it is happening every single day as we speak.
Someone on Facebook asked, would you be in favor of legislation that would sever spousal rights or allow divorce proceedings to be enacted on behalf of an incapacitated person in the event that there's a clear conflict of interest, such as when the spouse is acting as guardian begins a new relationship while refusing to file for divorce?
Well, in my sister's case, absolutely. If you present a case like that to me, how can you allow someone like Michael Schiavo, who obviously his loyalties had shifted to his new fiancée and his family, he had 2 children with this woman. How can you allow someone like that make decisions regarding Terri's well-being or what's in her best interest, particularly when there's a family standing by that's willing and wanting to care for her?
Right.
So yeah, that was just again something that didn't make absolutely no sense, and something needs to be done to better protect people with these types of disabilities. That's why I think healthcare surrogates, people who speak for you if you ever become incapacitated, is something we should all do before we ever do become in a situation where we perhaps can't speak for ourselves.
What would you say to people, Bobby, who try to frame Terri's situation and situations of others like her as a right to die issue, and the fears that people have of themselves, being hooked up to machines for periods of time? How would you address that to someone who thinks that the issue is about a right to die?
Well, they're not dying, first of all. And as in Terri's case, they're not hooked up to any machines.
Right.
And that's what I want to make clear to people. Our organization, most of the time, we only advocate people that are being sustained by only food and water through feeding tube and are not dying. Now, when you enter into the dynamics of the situation, actual machines, perhaps ventilators or respirators, or whatever machines that are aiding a person to keep alive, I think that's a case-by-case basis.
Sure.
And you can't just make a blanket comment on how you would treat those cases, because really each one could be different. But when you're talking about a person who's not dying and only being sustained by food and water, then I believe we are obligated, as a society, we are morally obligated to care for these people.
Right. So for me to follow, the clear distinction is, food and water is a basic right, whether you're getting it from a cup or from a feeding tube, as opposed to, where the issue gets more clouded in respirators and ventilators that are used, that kind of being separated. Is that really the key distinction that you're showing between?
Yes, because there are situations where it could be appropriate.
Sure.
To stop certain types of machines, keeping a person alive, and there are circumstances where food and water can also be stopped if it is causing a significant amount of pain, or if it's not, if a person is imminently dying. So you really need to make that distinction when you are talking about these types of situations.
Bobby Schindler is the executive director of the Terri Schiavo Life and Hope Network. You can visit their website at terrysfight.org. Bobby, thank you for joining us tonight.
Yes.
Well, it's my pleasure. I really appreciate you having me on, and God bless you in the work you're doing as well.
And to you, the viewer, thanks for watching and have a great week.
You've been watching Life Report, pro-life talk, real-world answers. Life Report is produced by Right to Life of Central California. Visit their website at fresnoprolife.org.